Hello, history nerds and historians. My name is Christina, and this is Effed Up History, but also kind of witchery. This is where we talk about a little tidbit from history and also witch history that's super fucked up. I know, I'm sorry, I am the worst. I am the worst podcaster to ever podcast. This year I have released a grand total of 5 episodes, and 2 of them were collaborations. I understand. I am also very disappointed in me. I'm sorry. I have just been so busy, and for some reason, the second that I turned 32, my body decided that my bedtime is now 9:30 p.m. So when I used to stay up late and work on this podcast until like 2 o'clock in the morning, I'm now like snug as a little bug in a rug practicing for my funeral. By 9:30, I am clocking into the dream office for my 9-hour shift and taking no lunch breaks. I am shutting down the meat suit for maintenance, if you know what I mean, and just descending into the darkness dimension. I am no better than a static display in the bed museum. I am a blanket burrito, friends. I'm sorry. I'm not sure if I've decreased my caffeine intake too much or if I've just increased my depression, but regardless, here I am, because it's spooky season, and I have been summoned. Today I would love to tell you about the most batshit suspicious death that I've researched since the death of Amy Dudley. This person was a woman who was found dead in such a way that one man said could only have been done by witchcraft or the devil. Today, friends, for Halloween, we are going to talk about the suspicious 17th century death of Christian Trask. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and practice your spookiest, oh good God, what the fuck faces. I will say before we begin, just a couple things. First thing, trigger warning, death, murder, talk of religion, and suicide, and all of those things that are uncomfortable when talking about, like, I guess this is also effed up true crime. So lots of things going on with that. Also, if you hear anything in the background or any noise in the background, there are like several brush fires in Salem right now. So if you hear like, you know, sirens or anything like that, I'm fine at the moment. However, you know, there are brush fires like right down the street from me. So that's super fun. But anyway, I guess it just adds to like the scary nature of Halloween week in Salem. So to get to talk about Christian Trask. Christian Trask was actually born Christian Woodbury in Beverly, Massachusetts, which was literally just over the bridge from Salem, on April 20th, 1661. Now, the Woodburys were basically like Beverly OGs. In the 1630s, there were 5 families who went over to Beverly to settle the land that had already been settled by the Nomcake people who were over there for hundreds of years, but that's besides the point. These families were the Conants, who the Patriarch Roger was responsible for settling like 5 cities, I think, including Salem. The Bulches, the Palfreys, the Trasks, and the Woodburys. Not much is really known about Christian's upbringing or how she was as a child, but we do know that she knew how to read and write, which is awesome to think about considering that she was a woman and most men were not even educated at this point. And yet here she is being amazing. And we know that she could read and write because of some things that are brought up during her case later on. 2 weeks before Christian's 18th birthday, she married John Trask, who was another one of the Beverly OG families. Again, not much is really known about their marriage, at least not much that I could find, honestly, except that they had 5 children very quickly. Their first daughter was also named Christian, and she was born in 1680. Their son, John, was born in 1683. Edward was born 1685, Elizabeth was born 1687, and their final son, William, was born in 1689. Really, everything with Christian that has to do with this episode and with this case really starts to about like 1686 or 1687. She was a member of the First Parish Church in Beverly, which was overseen by Reverend John Hale, who I will have to do an episode on at some point because he's also a really fascinating figure. Anyone who has any working knowledge of the Salem witch trials or has even like seen the Crucible is probably familiar with John Hale. He was, if I recall, quite a significant character in the Crucible, and also wrote a book about the witch trials from his firsthand account. And as far as my knowledge goes, he's the only one that was really like in the thick of everything who ended up writing a book about it. It's called A Modest Inquiry into the Nature of Witchcraft, and there's like a whole reason why he chose that name, which we'll save for his episode because that doesn't really matter for this right now. There's also significant testimony from him that has been documented from the Salem witch trials, which is where most of this information is coming from about Christian. Now, before I continue telling you about Christian Trask and what Reverend Hale said about her and her suspicious death, I want to tell you a little bit about her neighbors, the bishops, who become very important to this story. And I kind of just want to tell you about the kind of people they were because I think it sort of sets the scene for everything. So if the name Bishop sounds familiar and you've listened to my episodes, the first victim of the Salem witch trials, Bridget Bishop, is often conflated with the story of Sarah Bishop, one of Christian's neighbors. So some sources, or even like some tour guides and podcasts and websites, will tell you that Bridget Bishop lived in, at that point, what was Salem town, which is modern day Salem today. If you come into Salem, her house was like right across the street from what's now City Hall on Washington Street. And then if you go down a little bit farther down the street to where like Turner's Seafood is, which if you've never been to Salem won't make much sense to you, but it's literally like a half a block away from where her house was, used to be all apple orchards that belonged to her. And then it was kind of like right next to the courthouse and the jail. So she was just really in the center of the city, and she had a lot of land in the city, which was rare because most of Salem town at that point had no farmland really, or very minimal farmland. So for her to have like a giant apple orchard in the middle of town was pretty impressive, if you ask me. But some people will tell you that Bridget Bishop, despite living in the heart of Salem town and having a huge apple orchard in Salem town, also ran an illegal tavern in what is now Danvers. Which doesn't make sense. Like, why would she have a tavern in a place where it would take hours for her to travel to, like, back and forth, when she could have just done it out of her own house in Salem? I mean, laws and everything put in place, whatever. But, like, still, like, why would she go travel all that far away and not just try to do it in Salem town? And when you look deeper into the records, you realize that during the trials, both Bridget Bishop and Sarah Bishop were referred to as Goody Bishop, which is basically just like the Puritan version of Mrs. It means good wife. And they were both married to men named Edward Bishop. Now, there may have been some relation between these families, but most historians sort of lean towards saying that they were probably not closely related. There are some sources that say that Edward Bishop that was married to Sarah was potentially like the son of the Edward Bishop that was married to Bridget, but when you really look into it, it doesn't really fully seem like that's the case. But genealogy, going back that far, is weird, and it gets to be very confusing because the record keeping wasn't that great. So I will say that I think that they're most likely not related, but don't like quote me on that. Admittedly, I will say I've not done a full deep dive into that relationship, which I know is weird for me because I usually go down crazy rabbit holes and become obsessed. But I stopped myself and told myself that at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because we're not talking about Edward Bishop and Edward Bishop. We're talking about Christian Trask and mostly Sarah Bishop. What matters is that the person who ran an illegal tavern out of their home was Sarah Bishop and her husband Edward, who lived in what is now Danvers. And we know that they ran an illegal tavern out of their home because Edward at one point was actually fined for the illegal sale of alcohol. Now, there are some people that say that like, oh, it wasn't a tavern. He just like made alcohol and like, you know, had some stuff, and then when he had friends over, if they just like give him a little bit of money, like who's to say anything. But I'm of the firm belief that they ran an illegal tavern because of the things that we hear later on. Back then, where they were living, even though it's what is now Danvers, it was technically considered Beverly during this time because the borders of Beverly and Danvers, from what I've gathered, have kind of gone back and forth over the years. And in addition to this illegal tavern, Sarah and Edward Bishop were arrested in April of 1692 for the crime of witchcraft. I will say here, neither one of them were executed for it. They lived years after the witch trials ended. However, they were charged with witchcraft, and there was evidence being built against them. The story goes that Edward and Sarah Bishop escaped from prison, which is why they never fully went to trial. And when they came back after the trials had already ended, they just lived on with their lives. But I can't fully attest to the validity of that, because some people think that that was malarkey. But again, that's not what this episode is about today. History is really complicated, okay? And I'm trying to stay on point for you all. But here are some of the pieces of evidence that was brought against the bishops, specifically Sarah, but also Edward Bishop as well. During Sarah's trial, a woman named Elizabeth Balch, who was also part of one of those original Beverly families, came forward to say that there was this one point where she witnessed an argument between Sarah and Edward Bishop. And when the argument got super heated, Edward turned towards Elizabeth as they were like riding. So the story goes is like, they were in town, and like Elizabeth and her sister were like both on horseback, and they were riding home from Beverly. And they had to like cut through Danvers and go the long way because there was no bridge in place yet. And then Sarah and Edward Bishop like also came up after them, and these things happened where they like got too close to the water, and Sarah was like, "Hey, you're getting me all wet." And he's like, "Hey, shut up, that doesn't matter." And then like he started riding really fast, and she's like, "I'm gonna fall off." And he's like, "Shut up, it doesn't matter." And then after all of this happens, he turns towards Elizabeth Balch, and he's like, "This lady, she's been a pain in my ass since the day that we got married, but lately she's been so much worse because," quote, "the devil did come bodily unto her, and she was familiar with the devil, and she sat up all night long with the devil." So in around 1685, when this happened, Sarah's own husband was accusing her of witchcraft. During her trial, another person named Sarah Gadges also comes forward, and she gives an account that she knew from David Balch around the same time period as the Elizabeth Balch evidence. So David, at this point, it was like probably around 1685 as well, and he was a very sickly child, about like 15 years old or so, and claimed that in the middle of the night he was being bewitched by 4 women, and he names them as Dorcas Hoare, who I am obsessed with. We'll be doing an episode on at some point because she's the coolest in my opinion. An unnamed woman from Marblehead, and there's really only one woman from Marblehead that was accused during the trials, which was Margot Red, so probably her. Sarah Wilds, who is executed for the crime of witchcraft, and her daughter. And they don't specify who her daughter is. Now, Sarah Bishop was actually the stepdaughter of Sarah Wilde. So like Sarah Bishop's maiden name was Sarah Wilde as well. So there are some people who think that when they said Sarah Wilde and her daughter, they're referring to Sarah Bishop. Although when you read like the University of Virginia has digitized all of the records and like classified all of the records by person. So when you read Sarah Bishop's like page or like her file, I guess, it's not listed in there, but there are a lot of people who believe that this was one of the things that was implicated to Sarah Bishop as well. And I will say the reason why we have this from Sarah Gadges and not from David Balch is because David Balch died like right after all of this happens. So, you got that going for you as well. The whole story with David Balch is actually kind of funny. He like wakes up in the middle of the night and he's like, "Oh, there are 4 women and they're sitting at the edge of my bed menacingly." And there's another guy in the room and he's like, you need to punch them. You need to make them leave. And the guy can't see them because of spectral evidence, which if you want more information about that, listen to my Salem Witch Trials episode from last year. But the guy just like punches the air and David Balch is like, "Oh, thank you. They're gone now. Thank you so much." And it's just like a really funny little kind of story. But it must have been terrifying at the time for David Balch because like to him, it was real. And to everyone else sitting there, it was real because they all believed in the legitimacy of witchcraft. But the big evidence against Sarah Bishop and her husband came from Reverend John Hale talking about the suspicious death of Christian Trask and her symptoms before her death, which seemed very similar to bewitchment. So on May 20th of 1692, Reverend John Hale takes a stand to tell them about Christian's fits and distractions, is what he calls them. Now, by fits, he most likely means fits of anger directed at the bishops. So he says 5 or 6 years ago, so 1686 or 1687, Christian Trask began coming to him complaining about her neighbors, the bishops. She said that they would stay up until all hours of the night, having friends over, or maybe patrons, if it actually was an illegal tavern. And these people that they had over would be like screaming and cheering and talking loudly and playing shuffleboard into all hours of the night. Christian at this point had 4 small children at home, and maybe connected to this, her oldest daughter died in 1687. So in addition to having 4 small children at home, one of those children may have also been sick. I'm not sure what the younger Christian Trask died of. I just know that she died in 1687. So it could potentially be that, like, she had a sick child at home while these people were, like, partying and screaming and playing shuffleboard until all hours of the night. I will say, like, I have one child. He is 6. And I also have a neighbor who lets her dog run around and bark on and off all day from 7 in the morning until sometimes as late as like 9 or 10 in the evening. And I, as a mother of one, have become incredibly frustrated at times that this woman allows her dog to bark outside at all hours of the night when my son is sleeping. Now, I could not imagine having 4 children, potentially one of them being sick and dying, with an illegal bar next door and people screaming to all hours of the night and playing a silly game. Like, how do you even see shuffleboard in the dark during this time period? Are they playing shuffleboard by candlelight, or are they just playing it in the dark and, like, just because they're drunk? Like, I have no idea. In addition to this, we must remember that these are very religious people as well. So Christian was also worried about her children being corrupted by being so close to all of this that was happening into all hours of the night. Christian had tried to talk to the bishops about this before. She had allegedly tried to reason with the bishops before, and it really didn't seem to amount to anything. At one point, she became so angry with the bishops that she actually stormed over to their house, picked up all of the shuffleboard pieces, and threw them into the fireplace. So after this, Christian actually goes to Reverend Hale and asks him to intervene and tell the bishops to stop, which he can't really do. I mean, like, he's the reverend. Like, if they're staying up late, he can't really, like, fully stop them. He can advise them that maybe what they're doing is not very godly, and they're not being good neighbors, which, like, the Bible tells you, love thy neighbor. But he can't just be like, hey, stop doing what you want in your own home, like, you know. And at one point, she gets so angry that she actually asks him to deny them the Lord's Supper on Sunday until they stop, which is also, like, not really something that he can do. And according to his testimony, that night when she comes home is when, according to her husband, John Trask, her distractions began. He said that he went to her and they fasted and prayed together to try to end her distractions, and that he was often there when these happened. And at the time, he viewed them what he called distractions, but we would call them like a mental health episode or something like that. And yet at times he did fear that they might be worse than that. But in this May 20th, 1692 testimony, he says, quote, "But since I have seen the fits of those bewitched at Salem Village, and I call to mind some of hers to be much like some of theirs." He says that Christian thankfully recovered from these distractions, and once she sort of like broke out of it, she had strong suspicions that she had actually been bewitched by the bishops, specifically Sarah Bishop. And this coincides with potentially David Balch accusing her of witchcraft, and Elizabeth Balch having her experience where Edward is calling her a witch. So the whispers of Sarah Bishop being a witch are much earlier than 1692, right? And from that point on, Christian says that she like refused to try to even interact with Sarah next door. He then says that sometime later, so he doesn't specify how much later, but he says sometime later, she had another distracted fit on the Sabbath day at the public meeting house, and it continued on and on for over a month. And sometimes this fit would get so extreme that she was, quote, under temptation to kill herself or somebody else. John Hale said that he went to one of Christian's friends and asked her, like, what was she doing before this distraction began? And she just said that she'd been reading the scripture, and actually the day before this whole new fit began, she weirdly came home and said, actually, Sarah Bishop and I are now good friends. Reverend Hale said that he would still go over there to constantly pray with Christian and counsel Christian about what she should do. And a few days before her death, she seemed like she was improving. He said that she was rational and actually really desired that Edward Bishop be called for so that she can make friends with him. And when Reverend Hale was like, did you do wrong by him in some way? She's like, I don't think so, except for maybe the time where he threw all the shuffleboard pieces into the fireplace, and then asked Reverend Hale, like, is that evil that I did that? And if it is evil, I'm really sorry that I did that, and like, can you go get him, because I desire to be friends with him and I desire to apologize to him so that he can forgive me. And right before she died, Reverend Hale said that he received a note from her that she earnestly desired prayers on her behalf, and that she was coherent enough to have actually written the note herself based on both what her husband John had said, and also at this point of Reverend Hale just being like super familiar with her handwriting, he knew that she had written it herself. And then on June 3rd, 1689, Christian Trask was found dead. Reverend Hale remembered this in such detail because the circumstances of her death were horrific. John Hale wasn't a doctor. Like, there were some reverends at this time that were doctors as well as men of God. John Hale was not one of those. But John Hale was a Harvard-educated minister and was most likely the most well-educated man in Beverly and had some working knowledge of like anatomy and whatnot. And we know that because of how he describes the wounds that she died from. At his testimony, he states, quote, "As to the wounds she died of, I observed 3 deadly ones, a piece of her windpipe cut out, and another wound above that through the windpipe and gullet, and the vein that they called jugular. And next to her body was the presumed weapon that caused these injuries, which was a small pair of scissors." And the way that it's described makes it sound like a small, like, sewing scissors. Because her death was so suspicious, an inquiry was made into the cause of her death. And by that, I don't mean like the cause of her death, because obviously it was her injuries, but like how she came about those injuries. During this time, in the 1680s, there were obviously no forensic specialists. There were no crime scene investigators or anything like that. So when there was a suspicious death or even like an incredibly violent death, the protocol was to form a jury who would be presented with all of the evidence, who would then together determine the cause of death. Significant men from town were summoned to serve on this jury, and they included Joshua Rea Jr., James Putnam, Joseph Herrick, Daniel Andrew, Nathaniel Hayward, Thomas Raymond, Benjamin Balch, the father of David Balch, James Kettle, William Raymond Jr., and Edward Bishop. Yes, I said Edward Bishop. Isn't that incredibly suspicious? Like, her neighbor, Edward Bishop. Isn't that sus? Like, wouldn't you think that this man is a little bit too close to the case to be able to serve on this jury? And yet here he is, one of the men that will determine Christian's cause of death. And when presented all of the evidence, these 10 men come to the determination that Christian Trask had committed suicide. How? I mean, it's not impossible, like, people, if they're suffering from incredible mental illnesses, have been known to do things like this to themselves. However, I highly doubt that Christian would have been able to do that to herself. 3 significant wounds to her neck, including cutting out her own windpipe. It seems to me like she was murdered, and it's highly suspicious that the neighbor that she had been feuding with for years was one of the men that determined that. And John Hale clearly felt the same way that I do about it, because even 3 years later, when he was giving his testimony, he ends his statement by saying, quote, "So that I then judged, and still do apprehend it impossible for her, with so short a pair of scissors, to mangle herself so, without some extraordinary work of devil or witchcraft." So what do you think her cause of death was? Murder? Suicide? Or was she truly just a victim of the devil? Thanks thank you so much for listening today. If you like what you heard and want to hear more, please consider subscribing or leaving a review or joining my Patreon. And remember, friends, history may be watching you, so don't fuck it up. And be careful tonight, or the witches might get ya. Happy Halloween. Bye.